Margaret Whitmore had always prided herself on reading people like open books. Sitting across from her father-in-law at the mahogany dining table she'd insisted they buy for their Westchester home, she watched him cut his steak with the precision of a man half his age. At 85, Harold Whitmore moved with an economy of motion that spoke of decades spent building the construction empire that now bore his name. But Margaret saw something else entirely. She saw opportunity. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Harold, she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured concern she'd perfected over 12 years of marriage to his son. You really should consider slowing down. At your age, every day is precious. Harold paused mid-chew, fixing her with those steel-gray eyes that had intimidated union bosses and city councilmen for 6 decades. My age, he repeated, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. Margaret, I ran 8 miles this morning before most people had their first cup of coffee. That's exactly what I'm worried about, she pressed on, ignoring the warning look from her husband David across the table. All that strain on your heart, the doctor said I have the cardiovascular system of a man 20 years younger, Harold interrupted. Dr. Patterson's exact words were, remarkable for any age, extraordinary for 85. Margaret's smile never wavered, though her grip tightened imperceptibly on her wineglass. She'd learned long ago that direct confrontation with Harold was futile. The man had built Whitmore Construction from a single pickup truck and a borrowed drill into a $100 million enterprise, by never backing down from a fight. But he was still human, and humans had weaknesses. His weakness, she'd discovered, was his granddaughter. Speaking of Dr. Patterson, Margaret continued seamlessly, Emma was asking about her college fund yesterday. She's so excited about her early acceptance to Stanford. You know how much that means to her, especially after losing her mother so young. The mention of Emma caused Harold's expression to soften fractionally. At 17, Emma Whitmore was the light of his life, the daughter of his late son Michael, who died in Afghanistan 12 years ago. Harold had legally adopted Emma after Michael's death, and she was the one person who could consistently break through his gruff exterior. Emma's college is taken care of, Harold said firmly, has been since the day she was born. Of course it is, Margaret agreed. You've always been so generous with family. It's just that with college costs these days, and then graduate school, and maybe law school after that. She's so bright, Harold. She could be anything she wants to be. David Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his chair. At 43, he'd spent his entire adult life walking the tightrope between his formidable father and his ambitious wife. Dad's right, honey. Emma's future is secure. But Margaret was just getting started. I've been doing some research, she said, producing a folder from beside her chair with the theatrical timing of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Do you know what the average lifespan is for men in your profession? The stress, the physical demands, the decades of exposure to construction materials that weren't exactly regulated in the 60s and 70s? Harold's jaw tightened. What exactly are you getting at, Margaret? I'm not getting at anything, she replied, her voice dripping with false innocence. I'm just saying that we should be realistic about planning for the future. Emma's future. David's future. The company's future. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harold set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter-in-law with the same intensity he'd once reserved for analyzing blueprints and cost estimates. You think I'm dying, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Margaret's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of something cold and calculating before she recovered. Harold, we're all dying. Some of us just have more time than others. And you think I don't have much time left? I think, Margaret said carefully, that a man your age should consider the legacy he wants to leave behind, the impact he wants to have on the people he loves. Harold stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. David, walk me to my car. The 2 men stepped out onto the front porch, leaving Margaret alone at the dining table with her wine and her schemes. Through the window, she watched them talk in low, urgent voices beside Harold's vintage Cadillac DeVille, the same car he'd driven for 20 years because it still runs fine and I'm not dead yet. Dad, you know she doesn't mean anything by it, David was saying, though his voice lacked conviction. She's just worried about Emma's future, about our future. Harold studied his surviving son with a mixture of love and disappointment. David had never possessed the fire that Michael had, the drive that had built the Whitmore empire. He was a decent man, a competent project manager, but he lacked the killer instinct that separated successful businessmen from comfortable employees. Your wife, Harold said slowly, just spent an entire dinner trying to convince me that I'm on death's door so she can start planning how to spend my money. That's exactly what it is, Harold cut him off. The question is, are you in on it or are you just too blind to see what she's doing? David's face flushed red. Dad, I would never. I know you wouldn't, Harold said, his voice softening slightly. That's what makes this so dangerous, son. You're fighting a war and you don't even know it. As Harold drove away from his son's house, his mind was already working through the implications of Margaret's not-so-subtle campaign. He built his fortune by recognizing opportunities and threats before his competitors did, and Margaret Whitmore was definitely a threat. The next morning, Harold sat in Dr. Patterson's office, not for a regular checkup, but for something far more comprehensive. I want the work, Bill, he told his longtime physician. Blood work, stress test, cardiac imaging, neurological screening, everything you can think of. Dr. William Patterson had been treating Harold for 15 years, ever since Harold's previous doctor had retired. A tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Bill had seen Harold through a mild heart episode at 72, prostate surgery at 78, and the crushing grief following Michael's death. Harold, you just had your annual physical 3 months ago, Bill said, pulling up Harold's file on his computer. Everything came back perfect. Better than perfect, actually. Your numbers would make a 50-year-old jealous. I need documentation, Harold said grimly. Official documentation that I'm not knocking on death's door. Bill raised an eyebrow. Family pressure? You could say that. Bill leaned back in his chair, understanding immediately. He'd seen this scenario play out countless times. Adult children or their spouses growing impatient for inheritance, convinced that elderly parents were hiding health problems or living in denial about their mortality. Well, I can't argue with being thorough, Bill said. When do you want to start? 3 days later, Harold found himself undergoing the most comprehensive medical examination of his life. The stress test revealed a cardiovascular system that functioned at 95% efficiency. The cognitive screening showed mental acuity that scored in the top 10% for his age group. Blood work revealed cholesterol levels that most 30-year-olds would envy and inflammatory markers so low they barely registered. Harold, Dr. Patterson said, reviewing the results in his office a week later, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've never seen numbers like these in a man your age. Your biological age is closer to 65 than 85. Put that in writing, Harold said. Already done. Bill handed him a thick folder containing every test result, scan, and analysis. I've also included a letter summarizing your overall health status. Harold, barring an accident or some unforeseeable illness, you could easily live another 15 to 20 years. Harold tucked the folder under his arm like a weapon. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. But as he drove home from the doctor's office, Harold's mind was working on a different problem entirely. Margaret's campaign to convince everyone he was dying wasn't just about inheritance anxiety. It was too calculated, too systematic. She was building a narrative, laying groundwork for something bigger. That evening, Harold made a phone call to someone he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Vincent, he said, when the familiar voice answered. It's Harry Whitmore. I need a favor. Vincent Carlucci had been Harold's lawyer for 30 years before retiring to spend more time with his grandchildren. But retirement hadn't dulled his instincts for legal maneuvering or his ability to spot trouble from miles away. Harry, good to hear from you. What's the problem? My daughter-in-law thinks I'm dying, and I think she's planning accordingly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. How are we talking here? That's what I need you to find out. 2 days later, Vincent called back with disturbing news. Harry, you're not going to like this. Margaret's been making inquiries about elder law attorneys. Specifically, attorneys who specialize in competency hearings. Harold felt a chill run down his spine. A competency hearing would allow Margaret and David to have him declared mentally unfit to manage his own affairs, effectively giving them control of his assets while he was still alive. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. There's more, Vincent continued. She's also been researching the legal requirements for power of attorney in cases of declining health. And Harry? She's been very careful to have these conversations when David isn't around. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Margaret wasn't just positioning herself for Harold's eventual death. She was planning to have him declared incompetent, so she could control his fortune while he was still breathing. "What are my options?" Harold asked. "That depends on how far you're willing to go to protect yourself," Vincent replied, "and how much you trust your son." Harold thought about David's confused expression during their conversation on the porch, the genuine bewilderment in his voice when he'd defended Margaret's motives. His son wasn't complicit in his wife's scheme. He was her unwitting accomplice. "I don't trust my son's judgment," Harold said finally, "but I trust his heart." "Then we need to be very, very careful about how we handle this," Vincent warned. "Because if Margaret succeeds in having you declared incompetent, it won't matter how healthy you actually are. She'll have legal control over everything you've built." That night, Harold sat in his study, surrounded by 40 years of business records, family photographs, and the medical reports that proved he was nowhere near death's door. But proving his physical health was only the first move in what was shaping up to be a complex and dangerous game. Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated her opponent. Harold Whitmore hadn't built a construction empire by accepting defeat, and he wasn't about to start now. But he also knew that his next moves would have to be planned with the same precision he'd once used to orchestrate billion-dollar building projects. The stakes couldn't be higher. It wasn't just his fortune at risk. It was his relationship with his son, his granddaughter's future, and the legacy he'd spent a lifetime building. Harold opened his laptop and began typing an email to his accountant, his estate planner, and his business attorney. If Margaret wanted to play games with his mortality, he was going to give her a lesson in just how dangerous it could be to underestimate a man who'd survived 8 decades of fighting for everything he'd ever earned. The war for Harold Whitmore's legacy had begun, and Margaret was about to discover that reports of his decline had been greatly exaggerated. Harold's granddaughter Emma burst through the front door of his Beacon Hill townhouse like a hurricane in designer jeans, her Stanford acceptance letter clutched in one hand and her car keys in the other. At 17, she possessed the same fierce intelligence that had made Harold a formidable businessman, combined with the kind of moral clarity that only came with youth. "Grandpa," she called out, her voice echoing through the marble foyer, "we need to talk." Harold emerged from his study, medical folder still in hand, surprised by the urgency in Emma's voice. She was supposed to be in school, but here she was at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, looking like she'd driven straight from Westchester without stopping. "Emma, what's wrong? Why aren't you in class?" She dropped her backpack and fixed him with a stare that reminded him uncomfortably of his late son Michael. "Because Margaret is telling everyone at the country club that you're showing signs of dementia." Harold felt his blood pressure spike. "She's what?" "Yesterday at tennis practice, I overheard her talking to Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Crawford. She was doing that thing where she pretends to be all worried and caring, but she's really just spreading gossip." Emma's voice dripped with disgust. "She said you've been forgetting things, getting confused about business matters, and making poor decisions. None of that is true." "I know it's not true." Emma exploded. "You helped me with my calculus homework last week and explained market derivatives better than my economics teacher. But Grandpa, people are starting to believe her." Harold sank into his leather armchair, the weight of Margaret's strategy becoming clearer. She wasn't just building a case for his incompetency in legal circles. She was creating public perception to support her narrative. "There's more," Emma continued, pacing the room like a caged tiger. "I heard her on the phone this morning with someone named Dr. Brennan. She was asking about, quote, evaluation procedures and, quote, documentation requirements." "Dr. Brennan?" Harold's mind raced through his mental Rolodex of medical professionals. "I don't know any Dr. Brennan." "That's because he's not your doctor," Emma said grimly. "I looked him up. Dr. Richard Brennan specializes in geriatric psychiatry and competency evaluations. Harold stared at his granddaughter in amazement. At 17, she'd already conducted more thorough reconnaissance than most private investigators. How did you find all this out? Emma's cheeks flushed slightly. I may have been listening at doors and checking browser histories. Don't look at me like that. Someone had to figure out what she was up to. Despite the gravity of the situation, Harold couldn't help but smile. Emma had inherited more than just his business acumen. She'd also inherited his willingness to bend rules when the stakes were high enough. Emma, this is dangerous territory we're walking into. Your stepmother isn't just gossiping. She's planning something that could destroy our family. Then we stop her, Emma said simply. We? You don't think I'm going to let her steal my inheritance while pretending to care about my college fund, do you? Emma's eyes flashed with anger. Besides, you're going to need help. Margaret underestimates me because I'm young, and she underestimates you because you're old. That gives us an advantage. Harold studied his granddaughter carefully. Emma was brilliant, fearless, and morally outraged, all qualities that could be assets in the coming battle. But she was also 17 years old and emotionally invested in the outcome. If we do this together, Harold said slowly, you need to understand that this isn't a game. Margaret is playing for keeps, and she won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in her way, including you. She's already hurt me, Emma replied. She's been lying about you, manipulating Dad, and treating me like a pawn in her little scheme. I'm done being polite. Harold made his decision. Then we need allies. People Margaret can't manipulate or intimidate. 2 hours later, Harold and Emma sat across from Patricia Morrison in her corner office at Morrison & Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. Patricia had been Harold's business attorney for 15 years, ever since Vincent Carlucci had recommended her before his retirement. At 55, she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and ruthless determination that had earned her a reputation as one of the city's most formidable legal minds. So let me understand this correctly, Patricia said, reviewing the notes Emma had compiled. Your daughter-in-law is systematically building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent, despite the fact that you just passed the most comprehensive medical examination of your life. That's exactly right, Harold confirmed. Patricia turned to Emma. And you discovered this how? Eavesdropping, social media stalking, and good old-fashioned detective work, Emma replied without shame. Patricia raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure I can use information obtained through unorthodox means. You can't use it in court, Emma corrected, but you can use it to know what we're up against. Harold watched Patricia's expression shift from professional skepticism to grudging admiration. She's got a point. Emma, have you considered law school? Stanford Pre-Law, class of 2028, Emma replied with a grin. Good choice, Patricia turned back to Harold. The bad news is that competency challenges are surprisingly easy to initiate and notoriously difficult to defend against, especially when there's family support for the petition. David would never support having me declared incompetent, Harold protested. David might not have a choice, Patricia warned. If Margaret can present enough anecdotal evidence of declining mental capacity, combined with expert testimony from Dr. Brennan, she could force David into a position where he has to choose between supporting the petition or appearing to be in denial about his father's condition. Emma leaned forward. What kind of anecdotal evidence? Forgotten appointments, confusion about financial matters, erratic behavior, poor judgment in business decisions, Patricia listed. The kind of things that are subjective enough to be believable but hard to disprove. Harold felt a chill of recognition. She could manufacture all of that. Exactly, and if she's been laying groundwork with social circles and family friends, she'll have witnesses ready to testify about their quote-quote concerns for your welfare. So what's our defense? Emma asked. Patricia smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. We get ahead of her. Harold, I want you to undergo a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Sarah Chen. She's the most respected geriatric psychiatrist in New England, and her assessments are considered the gold standard for competency evaluations. Won't that look suspicious? Harold asked. Not if it's part of a routine estate planning review, Patricia replied smoothly. Many wealthy individuals undergo cognitive assessments when updating their wills or establishing trusts. It's actually considered best practice. Emma was already taking notes on her phone. What else? We document everything. Every conversation with Margaret, every family gathering, every business decision Harold makes. We create a paper trail that demonstrates consistent, rational behavior. And we investigate Margaret, Emma added. Patricia shook her head. We don't investigate anyone. That's what private investigators are for. Harold pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Tommy Reeves owes me a favor. 24 hours later, Tommy Reeves sat in Harold's study, looking remarkably unchanged despite 15 years in private investigation. He'd worked construction security for Whitmore before transitioning to private detective work, and he still possessed the no-nonsense demeanor that had made him effective at both jobs. Margaret Whitmore, née Margaret Collins, Tommy read from his preliminary report, born in Albany, New York. Moved to Boston after college, worked in pharmaceutical sales before marrying your son. What about before Boston? Emma asked. Tommy's expression darkened. That's where it gets interesting. There's a 2-year gap in her employment history, right before she moved to Boston. And her college roommate mentioned something about Margaret having to, quote, start over after some kind of trouble in Albany. Harold exchanged glances with Emma. What kind of trouble? Still working on that, but I did find something else that might interest you. Tommy pulled out a photograph. This is Margaret having lunch yesterday with someone you might recognize. Harold stared at the photo in disbelief. Margaret was sitting across from Robert Ashford, Harold's nephew, and the one family member who'd always resented being left out of the Whitmore construction hierarchy. Bobby? Harold's voice was barely a whisper. They had a very animated conversation, Tommy continued, lots of documents changing hands. And Bobby looked pretty excited about whatever they were discussing. Emma snatched the photo for a closer look. Uncle Bobby was never at family dinners growing up. Mom always said he and Grandpa had some kind of falling out. Harold's jaw tightened. Bobby thought he deserved a bigger stake in the company because his father was my brother. When I refused to promote him beyond his abilities, he quit and started bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen. Sounds like Margaret found herself an ally, Tommy observed. Or a co-conspirator, Patricia added from the doorway. She'd arrived for their scheduled strategy session and caught the tail end of Tommy's briefing. This changes everything, Harold said grimly. If Bobby's involved, Margaret has access to inside information about the company, about our family dynamics, about our legal vulnerabilities. Emma was staring at the photograph with laser focus. Grandpa, what if this isn't just about having you declared incompetent? What if they're planning something bigger? What do you mean? Think about it. If you're declared incompetent, who takes control of your assets? Legally, it would be David as my next of kin and primary heir, Patricia answered. But David doesn't know anything about running the company, Emma continued. He'd need help, he'd need advisors, people he trusts. Harold felt the pieces clicking into place with terrifying clarity. People like his wife, and his cousin who understands the construction business. They're not trying to steal your money, Emma said, her voice filled with cold understanding. They're trying to steal your company. The room fell silent as the full scope of Margaret's plan became clear. This wasn't about inheritance anxiety or end-of-life planning. This was a sophisticated corporate takeover disguised as family concern for an aging patriarch. We need more information, Patricia said finally. Tommy, I want complete background checks on both Margaret and Robert. Financial records, employment history, any legal issues. Everything. Already on it, Tommy replied. And we need to start building our own case, Harold added. Not just proving that I'm competent, but proving that Margaret isn't acting in my best interests. Emma looked up from her phone, where she'd been typing furiously. I have an idea about that, but you're not going to like it. What kind of idea? Harold asked warily. The kind that involves me pretending to be on Margaret's side, Emma said with a smile that reminded Harold uncomfortably of her stepmother. Patricia shook her head immediately. Absolutely not. Emma, these people are playing for millions of dollars. They won't hesitate to hurt you if they discover you're working against them. They won't discover it, Emma replied confidently, because I'm going to give them exactly what they want. A concerned granddaughter who's worried about her grandfather's declining mental state. Harold studied his granddaughter's face, seeing something there that both impressed and terrified him. Emma wasn't just his ally in this fight, she was becoming a strategist in her own right. "It's too dangerous," he said finally. "Grandpa, they're already using me as motivation for their scheme. Margaret keeps talking about Emma's future and protecting Emma's interests. If I can convince her that I'm buying into her narrative, I can get information that no private investigator could access." Tommy leaned forward. The kid's got a point. Margaret's more likely to talk freely around family, especially family she thinks she's manipulating. Patricia sighed. If we consider this approach, Emma would need to be very careful. No recording conversations without consent. No accessing private documents without permission. Nothing that could be used against us later. "I understand," Emma said solemnly. Harold felt a familiar sensation. The same mixture of pride and terror he'd experienced watching Michael grow up, seeing his son develop the same fearless determination that had built the Whitmore legacy. "Emma," he said slowly, "if you do this, there's no going back. Once you start playing their game, you'll be in danger until we finish it." Emma met his gaze steadily. "Then we better make sure we win." As the meeting broke up and plans were set in motion, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. But Margaret had made the mistake of underestimating both him and Emma, and now she was about to discover that the Whitmore family hadn't built their fortune by backing down from fights. Hi, Will. The war for Harold's legacy had entered a new phase, and this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Emma's transformation into the perfect concerned granddaughter began at Sunday dinner 2 weeks later. She arrived at David and Margaret's house carrying flowers for Margaret and wearing the kind of worried expression that would have earned her an Oscar nomination. "Margaret," she said, embracing her stepmother with what appeared to be genuine affection, "I wanted to thank you for being so honest with me about Grandpa." Margaret's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. "Oh, sweetheart, I know it's hard to hear, but someone had to tell you the truth." David looked up from his newspaper, confusion evident on his face. "What truth?" Emma sat down beside Margaret on the couch, her body language perfectly calibrated to suggest intimacy and trust. "Margaret explained to me that Grandpa might be showing early signs of, you know." She let her voice trail off, as if the words were too painful to speak. "Signs of what?" David demanded, setting down his paper entirely. Margaret shot him a warning look. "David, we discussed this. The forgetfulness, the confusion about business matters, the way he's been making impulsive decisions lately." "What impulsive decisions?" David's voice was rising. Emma jumped in smoothly. "Like when he hired that new construction supervisor without consulting anyone, or when he forgot about the Phillips project meeting last month." Harold had never hired a new supervisor, and the Phillips project meeting had been canceled due to a city permit delay, facts that Margaret clearly hadn't verified before using them as evidence. But David's face immediately clouded with concern. "Dad forgot a meeting?" "He didn't forget," David started to protest, then stopped. "Did he?" Margaret reached over and squeezed David's hand. "Honey, I know this is difficult, but we have to face the possibility that your father needs more support than he's willing to admit." Emma watched this manipulation masterpiece unfold with a mixture of admiration and disgust. Margaret was expertly exploiting David's love for his father, turning his protective instincts against Harold himself. "What kind of support?" David asked weakly. "Well," Margaret said, her voice carefully modulated to suggest reluctance, "I've been researching elder care options." "Not nursing homes," she added quickly, seeing David's alarmed expression. "But maybe someone who could help him with daily tasks, keep track of appointments, make sure he's taking his medications properly." Emma leaned forward eagerly. "That sounds perfect. Someone who could be there all the time, right? To make sure he doesn't get confused or make any more mistakes?" "Exactly," Margaret beamed at Emma. "You're so mature, understanding what's best for your grandfather even when it's difficult." David was still struggling with the concept. "But Dad seems fine to me, sharp as ever." "Of course he does," Margaret said patiently. "People with early-stage cognitive decline often have good days and bad days. They can seem perfectly normal for hours or even days at a time." Emma nodded sagely. "That's what makes it so hard to recognize. But Margaret's right, Dad. We can't wait until Grandpa gets lost driving somewhere or forgets to turn off the stove. Has he done those things? David asked in alarm. Not yet, Margaret replied. But Dr. Brennan explained that we need to be proactive about these situations. David's head snapped up. Who's Dr. Brennan? Emma held her breath. This was the moment where Margaret would either reveal her hand or find a way to deflect. Dr. Brennan is a geriatric specialist I consulted about the warning signs to watch for, Margaret said smoothly. I wanted to make sure I wasn't overreacting to what I was seeing. You consulted a doctor about my father without telling me? I consulted a doctor about general elder care concerns, Margaret corrected. I never mentioned your father specifically. I was just trying to educate myself about what to look for. Emma could practically see David's resistance crumbling. Margaret was a master at making her deceptions sound reasonable, even noble. Maybe I should talk to Dr. Brennan myself, David said finally. Of course, Margaret replied immediately. I have his card upstairs. But David, I think we should approach this delicately with your father. You know how proud he is. If we suggest he needs help, he might get defensive and refuse altogether. Emma jumped back into the conversation. What if we started small? Maybe just suggest that he could use some assistance with organizing his schedule or managing his correspondence? Present it as helping him stay more efficient, not as questioning his abilities. Margaret looked at Emma with genuine appreciation. That's brilliant, Emma. Your grandfather would never accept help if he thought we were questioning his competence, but he might accept it if we frame it as business support. David nodded slowly. Dad's always been focused on efficiency. If we presented it as streamlining his operations. Exactly, Margaret agreed. And the right person could gradually take on more responsibilities as needed. Emma felt a chill at the implications of that statement. Margaret wasn't just planning to get a caregiver into Harold's life. She was planning to install someone who could gradually assume control over his affairs. Do you have someone in mind? Emma asked innocently. Actually, I do, Margaret replied. There's a woman named Carol Hendricks who specializes in executive assistance for seniors. She has experience with business owners who need help transitioning some of their responsibilities. Transitioning to whom? David asked. Margaret's smile was razor sharp. To their families, of course. To the people who love them and want to make sure their legacy is protected. After dinner, Emma excused herself to use the bathroom and quickly texted Harold. Margaret has someone picked out already, Carol Hendricks. Find out everything. But when she returned to the living room, she walked into the middle of a conversation that made her blood run cold. Bobby thinks the timing is perfect, Margaret was saying to David. With your father's condition developing, it makes sense to bring in someone with more construction experience to help manage the day-to-day operations. David was frowning. I still don't understand why Bobby's suddenly interested in helping with Dad's business. They haven't spoken in years. People change, David. Your cousin has matured, and he wants to make amends with your father, plus he has contacts in the construction industry that could be valuable. Emma settled back onto the couch, her mind racing. Margaret was already positioning Robert to take over business operations, while she maneuvered Carol Hendricks into position as Harold's caregiver. What exactly is Bobby proposing? David asked. Nothing formal yet, Margaret replied. Just offering his expertise as a consultant, while your father adjusts to having more help with daily tasks. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying precision. Margaret had orchestrated a complete takeover strategy. Neutralize Harold through a competency challenge. Install a caregiver who could control his access to information and visitors. Bring in Robert as the experienced business advisor, and use David's legitimate concern for his father to legitimize the entire operation. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Harold. Carol Hendricks doesn't exist. No licensing records, no business registration, no professional history. Emma excused herself again, this time claiming she needed to get something from her car. Outside, she called Harold immediately. Grandpa, we have a problem. Margaret's moving faster than we thought. I know, Tommy found out more about your Uncle Bobby. He's been in financial trouble for the past 3 years. His construction consulting business is about to go under, and he owes money to some very unpleasant people. So, Margaret's offering him a way out? More than that, She's offering him control of Whitmore Construction in exchange for his help in having me declared incompetent. Emma felt sick. How do we stop them? We don't. We let them think they're winning while we gather evidence. Grandpa, they're planning to bring someone into your house. Someone who doesn't exist. Then we'll be ready for her when she arrives. But when Emma returned to the house, she discovered that Margaret had been busy making phone calls. Good news, Margaret announced. Carol can start tomorrow. She's driving up from New York tonight. David looked surprised. That seems awfully fast. Your father's condition could deteriorate quickly, Margaret said with practiced concern. Dr. Brennan stressed the importance of early intervention. Emma's phone was buzzing with frantic texts from Harold, but she couldn't check them without arousing suspicion. Tomorrow seems perfect, she said aloud. Should I come over to help Grandpa get adjusted to having someone new around? That would be wonderful, Margaret replied. You're such a thoughtful granddaughter. Emma smiled sweetly while her mind screamed danger signals. Margaret was accelerating her timeline, which meant something had changed. Either she suspected that Harold was onto her, or she had a deadline she hadn't mentioned. As Emma drove home that night, her phone rang. Harold's voice was tight with urgency. Emma, get over here now. Tommy found out why Margaret's moving so fast. There's a clause in my will that she doesn't know about. If I'm declared incompetent within 6 months of any major business decision, that decision can be challenged in court. What business decision? 2 weeks ago, I updated my will to include a provision that would give you controlling interest in Whitmore Construction when you turn 25, with David as interim manager until then. Emma nearly swerved off the road. You did what? I wanted to make sure the company stayed in the family and went to someone with the intelligence to run it properly. But if Margaret succeeds in having me declared incompetent before the 6-month window closes, she can challenge that provision and potentially void the entire will update. How would she know about the timeline? She wouldn't unless… Harold's voice trailed off. Emma, who else knew about our meeting with Patricia Morrison? Emma's blood turned to ice as she realized the implications. Grandpa, I think we've been played. What do you mean? Patricia Morrison. When did you first start using her as your attorney? 15 years ago, when Vincent recommended her. And who introduced Vincent to Margaret when she first moved to Boston? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Bobby, Harold said finally. Bobby introduced them at some family function. Emma pulled over to the side of the road, her hands shaking. Grandpa, what if Patricia Morrison has been working for Margaret all along? What if everything we told her in that meeting went straight back to Margaret? That would mean Margaret knows we're onto her, knows about Tommy's investigation, and knows exactly what evidence we're trying to gather. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. We've been feeding information to the enemy. Harold's voice, when he responded, was colder than Emma had ever heard it. Then it's time to stop playing defense. Emma, how good are you at acting? What do you have in mind? Tomorrow, when this fake Carol Hendricks shows up at my house, I want you to be there. But I don't want you to be the concerned granddaughter anymore. What do you want me to be? I want you to be bait. As Emma sat in her car on the dark roadside, she realized that the game had just changed completely. Margaret hadn't just been planning Harold's downfall. She'd been orchestrating it with the help of people Harold trusted. The betrayal went deeper than they'd imagined, and now they were walking into a trap with their eyes wide open. But Harold was right about one thing. It was time to stop playing defense. If Margaret wanted to play dirty, she was about to discover that the Whitmore family had been fighting dirty for a lot longer than she had. Carol Hendricks arrived at Harold's Beacon Hill townhouse at precisely 9 a.m., carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was younger than Emma had expected, mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun and the bearing of someone accustomed to being in control. Harold answered the door himself, playing his role perfectly. You must be Carol. Margaret spoke very highly of you. Mr. Whitmore, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to helping you stay organized and efficient. Carol's voice had a slight southern accent that seemed calculated to sound trustworthy and non-threatening. Emma watched from the living room as Harold led Carol inside. noting how quickly the woman's eyes cataloged the expensive artwork, the antique furniture, and the obvious signs of wealth throughout the townhouse. This wasn't someone interested in providing elder care. This was someone conducting reconnaissance. "Emma, sweetheart," Harold called out, "come meet Carol." Emma bounded over with the enthusiasm of a teenager genuinely excited to meet someone who could help her beloved grandfather. "Oh my gosh, Carol, thank you so much for coming. I've been so worried about Grandpa managing everything by himself." Carol's smile became more genuine as she sized up Emma as an ally. "Your grandmother mentioned how concerned you've been. It shows what a caring family you have." "Margaret's my stepmother," Emma corrected, "but she's been amazing about looking out for Grandpa's well-being." "Of course," I misspoke. Carol's recovery was smooth, but Emma caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Someone who really knew the family wouldn't have made that mistake. Over the next hour, Carol conducted what she called an assessment of Harold's daily routines and needs. Emma watched with growing alarm as the woman systematically identified every point of vulnerability in Harold's life: who had keys to the house, where he kept important documents, what his daily schedule looked like, who his regular visitors were. "I notice you have a home office," Carol observed. "Do you conduct much business from here?" "Some," Harold replied carefully, "though I still go into the main office several days a week." "That's wonderful that you're staying active," Carol said, with practiced enthusiasm. "Though as we get older, it becomes so important to have backup systems in place. What would happen if you were sick one day and couldn't make it to an important meeting?" Emma jumped in eagerly. "That's exactly what I was telling Margaret. Grandpa needs someone who can step in when he's not feeling well." Harold played along perfectly, allowing a slight tremor to enter his voice. "I suppose there have been days lately when I've felt less sharp than usual." Carol leaned forward with the intensity of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Can you tell me about those days? What kinds of things feel more difficult?" "Sometimes I forget names," Harold said hesitantly, "or I'll walk into a room and forget why I went there. Little things, but—" "Those aren't little things, Mr. Whitmore. They're early warning signs, and I'm so glad your family recognized the importance of getting you help." Emma felt sick watching Carol expertly manipulate Harold into providing ammunition for his own competency challenge. Every admission of minor forgetfulness would be documented and used against him. "The most important thing," Carol continued, "is making sure you don't put yourself or others at risk by trying to handle responsibilities that might be becoming too challenging." "What kind of responsibilities?" Harold asked. "Well, managing finances, making important business decisions, driving long distances." Carol's list was clearly calculated to encompass every aspect of independent living. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her blood run cold. It was from Tommy Reeves. "Carol Hendricks is really Catherine Holbrook. Former nurse, lost license 2018 for falsifying patient records. Currently wanted in Florida for elder abuse." Emma excused herself to use the bathroom, her mind racing. Carol wasn't just a fake caregiver. She was a criminal with a history of exploiting elderly victims. Margaret had brought a predator into Harold's home. When Emma returned to the living room, she found Carol examining Harold's medication bottles from the kitchen counter. "Mr. Whitmore, I notice you're taking several medications. Have you ever forgotten to take them or accidentally taken them twice?" "Once or twice," Harold admitted, following Emma's earlier coaching to provide believable but minor admissions. Carol made a note in her tablet. "I think one of my first priorities should be taking over medication management. We can't risk any dangerous mistakes." Emma felt panic rising in her throat. If Carol gained control of Harold's medications, she could easily manipulate his mental state or even poison him gradually. "That sounds perfect," Emma said brightly. "Grandpa, wouldn't it be great to not have to worry about keeping track of all those pills?" But as Carol began outlining her proposed daily routine for Harold, Emma realized they were facing a more immediate problem. Carol wasn't just here to assess. She was here to stay. "I've brought enough clothes for a week," Carol announced. "Margaret suggested I move in temporarily while we establish new routines." Harold's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Move in? I don't think that's necessary." "Mr. Whitmore, I understand this feels overwhelming," Carol said with practiced patience, "but your family is concerned about your safety." What if you fell during the night? What if you had a medical emergency and couldn't call for help? Emma watched Harold struggle between maintaining his act and protecting himself from this immediate threat. If Carol moved in, she would have complete access to Harold's life, his business documents, and the ability to isolate him from anyone who might question her authority. Maybe we should start slower, Emma suggested desperately. Just day visits at first? Carol's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Emma, sweetie, I know change is scary, but your grandfather's safety has to come first. Margaret was very clear about the urgency of the situation. The use of Emma's name like a weapon told Emma everything she needed to know. Carol had been briefed not just about Harold's supposed condition, but about Emma's role as the concerned granddaughter who could be manipulated into supporting the plan. Harold's phone rang, providing a momentary distraction. "Excuse me," he said, walking into his study to answer it. Carol immediately turned to Emma with a different expression, colder, more calculating. "Emma, I need you to understand something. Your grandfather is sicker than he's willing to admit. The confusion, the memory problems. They're going to get worse, much worse." "How do you know that?" Emma asked, genuinely confused. "Because I've seen this pattern hundreds of times. Men like your grandfather, successful, powerful men, fight the hardest against accepting help. They'll put themselves and their families at risk, rather than admit they're not in control anymore." Emma felt a chill at Carol's matter-of-fact tone. This wasn't someone who had been fooled by Margaret's story about Harold's declining health. This was someone who knew exactly what she was participating in. "The important thing," Carol continued, "is that you support the decisions the adults in his life are making. Your stepmother and your father know what's best for him, even when he doesn't." "Of course," Emma replied weakly. "Good. Because there are going to be some difficult days ahead. Your grandfather might say things, make accusations, even claim that people are trying to hurt him. That's very common with his condition. But you can't let his paranoia upset you or make you doubt the people who are really trying to help him." Emma realized with horror that Carol was preemptively discrediting anything Harold might say about being framed or manipulated. If Harold tried to expose the conspiracy, Carol would dismiss it as symptoms of dementia. Harold returned from his phone call looking shaken. "Emma, I need to speak with you privately." Carol stood immediately. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, I think it would be better if I stayed present for any family discussions. One of the things we need to work on is avoiding situations where you might become confused or agitated." "I'm not confused," Harold said sharply. "Of course not," Carol replied, with the kind of patronizing tone reserved for children and the mentally impaired. "But stress can make anyone's thinking less clear, especially when we're dealing with big changes." Emma saw the trap closing around them. Carol was already assuming authority over Harold's interactions and decisions. In a matter of hours, she would have complete control over his environment. "Grandpa," Emma said carefully, "maybe Carol's right. Why don't you tell us both what's bothering you?" Harold met Emma's eyes, and she saw him make a decision that terrified her. He was about to break character and fight back, regardless of the consequences. "That phone call was from my attorney," Harold said slowly. "My real attorney, not the one who's been feeding information to my daughter-in-law." Carol's practiced smile faltered. "Mr. Whitmore, I think you might be confused about—" "I'm not confused about anything," Harold cut her off. "I know exactly who you are, Catherine Holbrook. I know about Florida, I know about your nursing license, and I know why Margaret really hired you." The transformation in Carol's demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The helpful caregiver mask disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. "You stupid old man," she said quietly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Emma backed toward the door, her heart pounding. "Grandpa, maybe we should." "Nobody's leaving," Carol said, reaching into her briefcase and pulling out a syringe. "Mr. Whitmore, you're about to have a medical emergency. A stroke, I think. Very common in men your age, especially when they're under stress." Harold moved to shield Emma, but Carol was faster. The syringe was in her hand, and she was moving toward him with the confidence of someone who had done this before. "The beautiful thing about strokes," Carol continued conversationally, "is that they can cause all sorts of neurological damage. Memory loss, confusion, impaired judgment. Even if you survive, No one will ever believe anything you say again." Emma's mind went blank with terror, but her body acted on instinct. She grabbed the heavy crystal vase from Harold's side table and hurled it at Carol's head. The vase connected with a sickening crack, and Carol stumbled backward, the syringe flying from her hand. Blood ran down her face as she regained her balance, her eyes filled with murderous rage. "You little bitch!" she snarled, lunging toward Emma. Harold intercepted her, and suddenly the refined townhouse living room became a battlefield. Carol fought with the desperate viciousness of someone who had nothing left to lose, while Harold struggled to protect Emma and restrain a woman 30 years younger than himself. Emma grabbed Harold's phone and dialed 911, shouting their address to the dispatcher while the fight continued around her. But as sirens began to wail in the distance, Carol broke free from Harold's grip and ran for the door. "This isn't over," she screamed as she fled. "You have no idea what's coming for you." Harold collapsed into his armchair, breathing heavily and bleeding from scratches on his arms. Emma knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she checked his injuries. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he gasped. "Emma, we need to call David immediately. Margaret sent an assassin into my house, and she's going to try to claim this never happened." But even as police sirens grew louder outside, Emma realized their real problems were just beginning. Carol's escape meant Margaret would know their cover was blown. The attempted poisoning proved that Margaret was willing to commit murder to get control of Harold's fortune. And somewhere in the city, David Whitmore was still completely unaware that his wife was a sociopath who had just tried to kill his father. As paramedics rushed into the townhouse and police began taking statements, Emma looked at her grandfather and saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fear, but a cold, calculating rage that reminded her why Harold Whitmore had never lost a business fight in 60 years. Kyle! The gloves were off now. Margaret had made the mistake of bringing violence into Harold's home, and she was about to discover that some old men were far more dangerous than they appeared. Detective Maria Santos had seen a lot of strange cases in her 23 years with the Boston Police Department, but an 85-year-old construction magnate fighting off a fake caregiver with a syringe full of poison was definitely a first. She sat across from Harold in his living room, now a crime scene draped in yellow tape, taking notes while EMTs finished treating his minor injuries. "Mr. Whitmore, help me understand this," Detective Santos said, her pen poised over her notepad. "You're telling me that your daughter-in-law hired this woman to poison you as part of a scheme to steal your company?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Harold replied, his voice steady despite the bandages on his arms. "And I can prove it." Emma sat beside him, clutching the folder of evidence they'd compiled over the past weeks. The folder that would have been useless if Carol had succeeded in her mission. "The problem," Detective Santos continued, "is that Catherine Holbrook has disappeared completely. No trace at your son's house, no sign of her at any local hotels, and the car she was driving was reported stolen 3 hours ago." Harold's jaw tightened. Margaret helped her escape. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence that Mrs. Whitmore knew about Catherine Holbrook's criminal background?" Emma opened the folder and handed Detective Santos a photograph. "This is Margaret having lunch with Catherine 2 weeks ago, before she was supposed to be Carol Hendricks, the helpful caregiver." Detective Santos studied the photo. "How did you obtain this?" "Private investigator," Harold replied. "Tommy Reeves. He's licensed, and everything he did was legal." "We'll need to speak with Mr. Reeves," Detective Santos said, making another note. "What about your son? Is he involved in this conspiracy?" Harold's expression softened slightly. "David doesn't know what his wife really is. He's been manipulated just like everyone else." "Then we need to bring him in before Mrs. Whitmore convinces him you're having some kind of paranoid episode," Detective Santos said grimly. "Because attempted murder aside, this looks like a sophisticated elder abuse scheme. If she can convince your son that you're mentally unstable, she can have me committed and take control of everything," Harold finished. "I know. That's why we need to move fast." Detective Santos closed her notepad. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to be honest with you. Without Catherine Holbrook in custody, this case is going to be very difficult to prosecute. It's your word against your daughter-in-law's, and she's going to claim you're delusional." Emma leaned forward. "What if we could get her to confess?" Both Harold and Detective Santos looked at her sharply. "Emma," Harold warned, "whatever you're thinking." "No, listen," Emma interrupted, her mind racing with possibilities. "Margaret thinks she's winning. She doesn't know we have evidence of her meeting with Catherine. And she definitely doesn't know we've figured out that Patricia Morrison is working with her." Detective Santos raised an eyebrow. "Patricia Morrison, the attorney?" "My grandfather's been a lawyer for 15 years, Emma confirmed. "Who's been feeding information to Margaret the entire time?" "That's attorney-client privilege violation," Detective Santos muttered, "if we can prove it." Emma's eyes lit up. "We can. Because I know exactly how to make Margaret think she's still in control while we record her admitting everything." Harold studied his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and terror. "Emma, these people tried to kill me today. I won't let you put yourself at risk." "Grandpa, they're going to try again. Carol escaped, which means they know their cover is blown. Margaret's going to accelerate whatever endgame she has planned." Detective Santos nodded grimly. "The girl's right. Attempted murder means they've crossed a line they can't cross. They're going to try to finish this quickly before we can build a case against them." Harold's phone rang, and all three of them tensed. The caller ID showed David's name. "Answer it," Detective Santos instructed. "Act natural." Harold put the phone on speaker. "Hello, David." "Dad, what the hell happened? Margaret just got a call saying there was some kind of incident at your house?" Harold met Detective Santos's eyes. She nodded for him to proceed carefully. "There was a misunderstanding with the caregiver Margaret sent over," Harold said. "It got a bit heated." "A misunderstanding? Dad, Margaret's crying. She says the woman called her, said you attacked her, and accused her of trying to poison you." Emma felt her stomach drop. Carol was spinning the story, making Harold look like the aggressor. "David, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Harold said. "Carol wasn't Hendricks isn't who she claimed to be. Her real name is Catherine Holbrook, and she's wanted for elder abuse in Florida." There was a long pause. "Dad, that's a very serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact. The police are here right now and we have evidence." "The police?" David's voice rose. "Dad, what have you done?" "I defended myself against someone who tried to inject me with an unknown substance," Harold said firmly. Another pause, then David's voice, quieter now. "Dad, Margaret thinks you might be having some kind of episode. The stress of aging, the pressure of running the company." Harold closed his eyes. Margaret was already working on David, convincing him that his father was delusional. "David, I need you to come over here. Bring Margaret if you want, but I need you to see the evidence with your own eyes." "I don't think that's a good idea right now. Margaret's really shaken up, and frankly, Dad, you don't sound like yourself." Detective Santos gestured for Harold to keep David talking. "What do you mean I don't sound like myself?" "You're talking about conspiracies, fake identities, people trying to poison you. Dad, do you understand how that sounds?" Emma watched Harold's face as his son's words hit home. Margaret had already poisoned David against him so thoroughly that even attempted murder sounded like paranoid fantasy. "David," Harold said slowly, "if I can prove to you that Carol Hendricks is really Catherine Holbrook, will you listen to what I have to say?" "Dad, I think you should talk to Dr. Patterson. Maybe spend a few days in the hospital for observation." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "You want to have me committed." "I want you to get help. Margaret's been trying to tell me that you've been showing signs of decline." "I didn't want to believe it, but after today." "After today, what?" "After today, I think Margaret was right to be concerned." The line went dead. Harold stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of betrayal settling over him like a shroud. "Your son's been completely manipulated," Detective Santos observed. "Margaret's turned him into her unwitting accomplice." Emma stood up, pacing the room with nervous energy. "We need to separate David from Margaret long enough to show him the evidence. But how?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. "Emma, you said Margaret thinks she's still winning. What if we let her think she's already won?" "What do you mean?" "Margaret's next move is going to be having me committed for psychiatric evaluation. She'll use today's incident as proof that I'm dangerous and delusional." Detective Santos nodded. It's a smart play from her perspective. Get you locked up in a psychiatric facility where no one will believe anything you say. Exactly. But what if we let her think she succeeded? Emma frowned. Grandpa, I don't understand. Harold turned to Detective Santos. How long would it take to process a psychiatric hold if my family petitioned for one? 72 hours minimum for evaluation, longer if they can convince a judge you're a danger to yourself or others. And during that time, I'd be isolated from outside contact? Essentially, yes. Limited visitors, monitored communications. Harold smiled for the first time since the attack. Perfect. Emma, how would you like to inherit a construction company? What are you talking about? Margaret's plan requires me to be declared incompetent so she can challenge my will update. But what if instead of being declared incompetent, I simply disappeared? Detective Santos leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, I hope you're not suggesting. I'm suggesting that Harold Whitmore has a heart attack tonight. A massive one. He's rushed to the hospital, but it's too late. The stress of the day, combined with his advanced age. Emma's eyes widened. Fake your own death? Temporarily, just long enough for Margaret to reveal her true intentions when she thinks she's won. Detective Santos shook her head. Mr. Whitmore, faking your death would be fraud. I can't be party to. You wouldn't be party to anything, Harold interrupted. You'd be investigating the suspicious death of a man who was attacked earlier today. Perfectly legitimate police work. Emma was already seeing the possibilities. If Margaret thinks you're dead, she'll move immediately to consolidate control. She'll have to coordinate with Robert and Patricia Morrison, probably over phone calls or emails that can be monitored. And she'll stop being careful about what she says, Harold added. Right now, she's paranoid that everything might be recorded, but if I'm dead, she'll think she's safe. Detective Santos was quiet for several minutes, weighing the ethical implications. Even if I agreed to this, and I'm not saying I am, how would we stage a convincing death? Medical records, death certificates, funeral arrangements. Harold pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I know someone who owes me a very big favor, Dr. Richard Chen at Massachusetts General. The cardiac surgeon? Detective Santos looked surprised. 20 years ago, I donated the money for the new cardiac wing at Mass General. Dick Chen was the department head who oversaw the project. He's also Sarah Chen's husband. Emma looked confused. Who's Sarah Chen? The geriatric psychiatrist Patricia Morrison recommended for my competency evaluation, Harold explained. The one who was supposed to be completely independent and unbiased. Detective Santos whistled low. Your fake lawyer recommended the wife of a doctor who owes you a major favor? Margaret doesn't know about my connection to the Chen family. Patricia probably figured she was being clever, recommending someone with an impeccable reputation who would give Margaret the evaluation she wanted. Emma grinned. But instead, Dr. Sarah Chen is married to someone who would do anything to help you. Harold nodded. Dick Chen can stage a convincing heart attack, complete with medical records and a death certificate. Sarah can provide the psychiatric evaluation that proves I was completely competent right up until my death. Detective Santos held up her hands. Even if this crazy plan worked, what happens when Margaret discovers you're not really dead? By then, we'll have everything we need to destroy her, Harold replied. Recorded confessions, financial records, evidence of the conspiracy with Robert and Patricia Morrison. Emma was already working through the logistics. We'd need somewhere safe for you to hide while you're supposedly dead. Tommy Reeves has a safe house he uses for witness protection cases, Harold said. Completely off the grid. Detective Santos stood up, pacing the room. This is the most insane plan I've ever heard. Will it work? Emma asked. Detective Santos stopped pacing and looked at both of them. It's crazy enough that it might. But if we do this, we're betting everything on one play. If Margaret discovers the deception before we get the evidence we need, then I'll really be dead, Harold finished, along with anyone else who gets in her way. Emma reached over and took her grandfather's hand. Grandpa, are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. Harold looked around his living room, still covered in crime scene tape from the morning's attack. He thought about Margaret's calculated manipulation of his son, about Patricia Morrison's betrayal of attorney-client privilege, about Catherine Holbrook's syringe full of poison. Emma, Margaret made the mistake of bringing violence into my home and threatening my family. She's about to learn that some fights are worth dying for. Detective Santos sighed heavily. God help us all, when do we start? Harold checked his watch. Margaret will be expecting me to either flee town or hole up here feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I'm going to do something she won't expect. What's that? I'm going to call her and apologize. As Harold reached for his phone to begin the most dangerous gamble of his life, Emma realized that her grandfather wasn't just fighting for his fortune anymore. He was fighting for his family, his legacy, and the principles that had guided him for 85 years. Margaret had chosen the wrong old man to me. 3 months after Margaret's arrest, Harold sat in the oak-paneled conference room of Sullivan and Associates, his new law firm, watching Patricia Morrison squirm in the defendant's chair. The former attorney who'd betrayed 15 years of trust looked nothing like the confident legal mind who'd once commanded respect throughout Boston's legal community. Patricia, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of profound disappointment, I trusted you with my life, my family's future, and my business secrets. I want to understand why you threw all of that away. Patricia's hands shook as she reached for her water glass. The woman who'd once negotiated billion-dollar construction deals now looked frail and defeated. Harold, you have to understand. Margaret didn't give me a choice. There's always a choice, Harold replied coldly. Tell me how this started. Detective Santos leaned forward from her position near the window. Patricia's cooperation was part of a plea agreement that would reduce her sentence from 10 years to 3, but only if she provided complete disclosure about the conspiracy. It began 2 years ago, Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret approached me at a charity function. She said she was concerned about your mental health, that David was too emotional to see the signs of your decline. Emma, sitting beside Harold, made a note on her legal pad. At 17, she'd become an unofficial paralegal in the case against her stepmother, her natural intelligence sharpened by her desire for justice. She asked me to keep an eye on your legal affairs, Patricia continued. Nothing illegal, she said. Just be aware of any concerning decisions you might make. And you agreed? Harold's tone could have cut glass. She was family, Harold, your daughter-in-law. I thought she genuinely cared about your well-being. Thomas Sullivan, Harold's new attorney, slid a document across the table. Ms. Morrison, this is a bank record showing a $50,000 deposit to your personal account 3 weeks after that charity function. Was that payment for your awareness? Patricia's face crumbled. Margaret said it was a retainer. For future legal services that might be needed, if your condition deteriorated. Harold felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained him through months of legal proceedings. What condition, Patricia? The condition that made me run 8 miles every morning and manage a $100 million business? I thought... Patricia's voice broke. Margaret showed me medical records. Cognitive test results that suggested early-stage dementia. She said you were hiding your symptoms out of pride. Emma looked up sharply. What medical records? Letterhead from Dr. Patterson's office. Test results showing memory problems, decreased cognitive function. Patricia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. I kept copies of everything. Thomas Sullivan examined the documents with growing amazement. Ms. Morrison, these are forgeries. Sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless. The dates are wrong, the patient ID numbers don't match Harold's medical record, and Dr. Patterson never administered these specific tests. Patricia stared at the papers in horror. They're fake, but they look so official. Margaret had professional help, Detective Santos interjected. We traced the documents to a medical fraud operation in Miami, the same group that provided Catherine Holbrook with her fake nursing credentials. Harold leaned back in his chair, a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. Patricia, the day Margaret asked you to recommend a geriatric psychiatrist for my competency evaluation, did you choose Sarah Chen yourself? Yes, I researched several options and selected Dr. Chen because of her reputation for thorough, unbiased evaluations. You didn't know that Sarah Chen is married to Dr. Richard Chen, the cardiac surgeon who helped me fake my death? Patricia's eyes widened. No, I had no idea. Margaret specifically requested someone with no connection to your family or business interests. Emma exchanged glances with Harold. Margaret thought she was being clever, recommending someone who would give her the evaluation she wanted. She had no idea she was actually recommending someone who owed Grandpa a massive favor. Thomas Sullivan made another note. Ms. Morrison, walk us through Margaret's escalation of demands. When did, quote, keeping an eye on Harold's affairs become actively sabotaging his legal interests? Patricia took a shaky breath. About 6 months ago, Margaret started asking more specific questions. She wanted to know about your estate planning, the details of your will, any recent changes or updates. And you provided that information? She said David needed to know for family planning purposes, that you were becoming secretive about your affairs and it was causing him anxiety. Harold's jaw tightened. Did it occur to you that there might be reasons I kept my estate planning private? I thought. Patricia struggled to find words. Margaret made it sound like you were becoming paranoid, hiding things from your own family. She said David was worried about your judgment. Emma leaned forward. What about the will update that gave me controlling interest in the company? When did you tell Margaret about that? Patricia's face went ashen. The same day you signed it. Margaret called me that evening, said she'd heard rumors about changes to your estate plan. She was concerned that you might be making impulsive decisions that could hurt the family. So you violated attorney-client privilege and told her exactly what Harold had decided, Thomas Sullivan said flatly. She said she just wanted to understand what David would be dealing with as executor, Patricia whispered. I thought I was helping the family prepare for difficult transitions. Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline where cranes from Whitmore construction projects dotted the horizon. Patricia, at what point did you realize that Margaret wasn't concerned about my well-being but was actively working against my interests? The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Patricia answered. When she asked me to delay filing your will update. She said the family needed time to discuss the implications of giving Emma so much control at such a young age. And you agreed to delay a legal document that your client had specifically requested? For 2 weeks, just to give everyone time to process the changes. Emma's pen snapped in her grip. Those 2 weeks were exactly the window Margaret needed to have Grandpa declared incompetent and challenge the will update. I didn't know that at the time, Patricia protested. Detective Santos pulled out her own folder. Ms. Morrison, phone records show 17 calls between you and Margaret Whitmore in the month before Harold's supposed death. What were you discussing? Patricia seemed to shrink in her chair. Margaret was getting more agitated. She kept talking about Harold's deteriorating condition, his erratic behavior, the need for intervention. What kind of intervention? She wanted me to initiate competency proceedings, said the family was afraid Harold might hurt himself or others if his delusions got worse. Harold turned from the window, his expression thunderous. Based on what evidence? The forged medical records, witness statements from family friends about your concerning behavior, Margaret's documentation of your confused and erratic actions. All manufactured, Thomas Sullivan noted. Ms. Morrison, did you verify any of this alleged evidence independently? Margaret was family. I trusted her word. Emma slammed her hand on the table. You trusted her word over 15 years of working with my grandfather? You knew him better than almost anyone, and you still believed he'd suddenly developed dementia? Patricia burst into tears. Margaret was very convincing. She had documents, witness statements, medical opinions, and she seemed so genuinely concerned about Harold's welfare. Harold returned to his seat, his anger giving way to a colder emotion. Patricia, tell me about Robert Ashford's involvement. Robert contacted me about 3 months ago, said he was concerned about the family business, that Harold was making decisions that could bankrupt the company. What decisions? Expensive projects with questionable returns, contracts with unreliable partners, financial commitments that didn't make business sense. Thomas Sullivan consulted his notes. Ms. Morrison, we've analyzed every business decision Harold made in the past year. The company's profit margins increased by 12%, and every major project came in under budget and ahead of schedule. Patricia stared at him in confusion. But Robert showed me financial projections, cost overruns, client complaints. More forgeries, Detective Santos confirmed. Robert Ashford was in debt to some very dangerous people. Margaret offered him a way out, in exchange for his help in convincing you that Harold was becoming incompetent. The full scope of the deception was finally becoming clear. Margaret had constructed an elaborate web of lies, using forged documents and false witnesses to convince Harold's own attorney that he was losing his mind. Patricia, Harold said slowly, when Catherine Holbrook showed up at my house with that syringe, did you know what Margaret was planning? No! Patricia's response was immediate and desperate. Harold, I swear to you, I had no idea Margaret was planning violence. I thought we were talking about getting you proper medical care. Detective Santos leaned forward. But you did know that Carol Hendricks wasn't a real caregiver. Patricia's silence was answer enough. How long had you known? Harold demanded. Margaret told me the night before Carol was supposed to arrive. She said she'd had to use a false identity because you were paranoid about strangers and might refuse help from someone with an obvious medical background. Emma shook her head in disgust. And that didn't raise any red flags for you? Margaret said it was a temporary deception, just to get you comfortable with having assistance. She promised that once you adjusted, she'd bring in someone properly credentialed. Harold felt a deep weariness settle over him. Patricia Morrison had been more than his attorney. She'd been a trusted advisor, almost a friend. Her betrayal cut deeper than Margaret's obvious greed or Robert's desperate opportunism. Patricia, I need you to understand something, Harold said quietly. Margaret didn't just steal money or betray family trust. She brought a violent criminal into my home with the intent to cause me serious bodily harm. Your cooperation made that possible. Patricia was sobbing openly now. Harold, I never wanted you to be hurt. I honestly believed Margaret was trying to help you. Your beliefs don't matter, Harold replied coldly. Your actions do, and your actions nearly got me killed. Thomas Sullivan slid another document across the table. Ms. Morrison, this is your formal statement for the district attorney's office. Please review it carefully and sign if it accurately reflects your testimony today. As Patricia read through the statement, Harold turned to Emma. How are you holding up with all this? Emma had been largely quiet during Patricia's confession, taking notes and observing the woman who'd helped orchestrate their family's near destruction. I keep thinking about Dad, she said softly, how he's dealing with learning that his wife was a sociopath. David Whitmore had filed for divorce the day after Margaret's arrest, but the emotional damage would take years to heal. He'd spent months being manipulated by someone he loved, turned against his own father by carefully constructed lies. Your father is stronger than he knows, Harold said. He'll get through this. Detective Santos gathered her files. Ms. Morrison, your cooperation today will be noted in your sentencing hearing. However, I want to be clear about something. Your license to practice law has been permanently revoked. You'll never work as an attorney again. Patricia nodded numbly. The woman who'd once been one of Boston's most respected lawyers was now facing prison time and professional disgrace. As the meeting concluded, Harold found himself alone with Emma in the conference room. The weight of the past months, the deception, the betrayal, the near-death experience, settled over both of them. Grandpa, Emma said finally, was it worth it? Everything we went through to expose Margaret? Harold considered the question carefully. Emma, I've learned that there are some things worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Family integrity, business ethics, the truth, these aren't negotiable. But Dad's marriage is destroyed, Patricia's career is over, and our family will never be the same. That's true, Harold acknowledged. But the alternative was letting Margaret succeed. If we hadn't fought back, she would have stolen everything I built and destroyed everything I valued. Sometimes the cost of justice is high, but the cost of injustice is higher. Emma nodded slowly. What happens now? Now we rebuild. Your father needs time to heal from Margaret's manipulation. Patricia serves her sentence and hopefully learns something about the consequences of betraying trust. Robert faces charges for his role in the conspiracy. And you, Harold smiled at his granddaughter, you finish high school, go to Stanford, and prepare to take over Whitmore Construction when you're 25. Do you really think I'm ready for that kind of responsibility? Harold looked at the young woman who'd helped him orchestrate one of the most complex stings in Boston legal history. Emma had shown intelligence, courage, and moral clarity throughout their ordeal. Emma, you outmaneuvered a seasoned con artist, helped expose a criminal conspiracy, and never lost sight of what was right. I think you're more ready than you know. 6 months later, Harold stood in the courtroom as Margaret Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and attempted murder. She looked nothing like the polished socialite who'd once charmed her way into the Whitmore family. Prison had stripped away her facade, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath. As the judge read the sentence, Margaret's eyes found Harold's across the courtroom. There was no remorse in her gaze, only the frustrated rage of a predator whose prey had escaped. Harold felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only relief that the threat was finally neutralized. Catherine Holbrook had been captured in Mexico and extradited to face charges in multiple states. Robert Ashford received 5 years for his role in the conspiracy. Patricia Morrison was sentenced to 3 years and would be eligible for parole in 18 months. David Whitmore sat beside his father in the courtroom, still processing the revelation that he'd been married to a woman capable of murder. The divorce had been finalized the previous month, with David receiving no alimony and Margaret forfeiting any claim to Whitmore family assets. As they left the courthouse, David finally spoke the words that had been weighing on him for months. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have seen what she was, should have protected you instead of doubting you." Harold put his arm around his son's shoulders. "David, Margaret fooled a lot of people. She had professional help, forged documents, and years to perfect her deception. You were her victim too. But I chose her over you. When you needed my support, I believed her lies instead of trusting my own father." "You believed someone you loved," Harold replied gently. "That's not a character flaw, son. That's what makes you a better man than the people who tried to destroy us." Emma joined them on the courthouse steps, her acceptance letter to Stanford Law School clutched in her hand. She'd decided to accelerate her timeline, planning to finish her undergraduate degree in 3 years and law school in 2. "Ready to take over the family business?" Harold asked with a smile. "Ready to make sure no one ever tries to steal it again," Emma replied with determination that reminded Harold of himself at that age. As the Whitmore family walked away from the courthouse together, Harold reflected on the lessons of the past year. He'd learned that trust was precious and easily broken, that family loyalty could be weaponized by those with cruel intentions, and that sometimes the people closest to you posed the greatest threats. But he'd also learned that love and determination could overcome deception, that truth had a way of surfacing despite elaborate lies, and that the bonds of real family were stronger than the manipulations of false ones. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Harold received an unexpected visitor at his Beacon Hill townhouse. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived with a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation that officially documented his mental competency at the time of the conspiracy. "Harold," Dr. Chen said, settling into his study with a thick folder, "I wanted to personally deliver these results and apologize for my profession's role in nearly destroying your life." Harold poured 2 cups of coffee, noting the irony that he was serving refreshments to the woman whose husband had helped him fake his own death. "Sarah, you had nothing to apologize for. Patricia Morrison recommended you because she thought you'd rubber stamp Margaret's narrative, not because you were part of the conspiracy. Still, the fact that medical fraud was used to manipulate legal proceedings," Dr. Chen shook her head. "I've reported the Miami operation to federal authorities. They've been using stolen medical letterhead and forged physician signatures to create fake competency evaluations for elder abuse cases across 6 states. Harold accepted the evaluation results, scanning the comprehensive cognitive assessment that proved his mental acuity was exceptional for his age. "How many other families do you think were destroyed by this operation?" The FBI estimates at least 40 cases over the past 3 years. Elderly victims whose children or caregivers used fake medical evidence to gain control of their assets. Dr. Chen's voice carried the weight of professional outrage. "Harold, you may have exposed one of the largest elder abuse networks in the country." That evening, Harold called a family meeting in the conference room at Whitmore Construction headquarters. David arrived looking healthier than he had in months, his posture straighter and his eyes clearer. now that Margaret's psychological manipulation was no longer poisoning his daily life. Emma burst through the doors with her characteristic energy, carrying a stack of business school textbooks and a laptop covered in Stanford Law School stickers. "Okay, family meeting called to order," Emma announced, taking her place at the polished conference table where Harold had made thousands of business decisions over the decades. "What's on the agenda?" Harold smiled at his granddaughter's eagerness to embrace her future role. "Several items. First, the FBI wants to interview both of you about Margaret's methods. They're building cases against similar operations in other states." David leaned forward. "What kind of interview?" "They want to understand how Margaret identified and exploited family vulnerabilities. Your marriage, my relationship with you, Emma's position as my heir. They think she followed a specific playbook for manipulating family dynamics." Emma was already taking notes. That makes sense. Margaret was too organized, too systematic. She had to have learned these techniques somewhere. "Special Agent Rebecca Martinez will be contacting you both next week," Harold continued. "Second item, the company's future structure." David and Emma exchanged glances. This was the conversation they'd all been avoiding since Margaret's arrest. "Dad," David said carefully, "I know you updated your will to give Emma controlling interest when she turns 25. I want you to know that I support that decision completely." Harold studied his son's face, looking for any sign of resentment or hurt feelings. "David, I need you to understand why I made that choice. You don't need to explain anything. Emma has the intelligence and the drive to lead this company. I don't." "That's not true," Harold replied firmly. "You have different strengths. You understand people, you build relationships, you inspire loyalty. Those are crucial leadership qualities." Emma looked up from her notes. "What if we don't have to choose between Dad's people skills and my strategic thinking?" Both men turned to her with interest. "I've been researching corporate governance structures at Stanford," Emma continued. "What if we created a dual leadership model? Dad as chief executive officer handling operations, client relationships, and day-to-day management. Me as chairman of the board, focusing on long-term strategy, major investments, and succession planning." Harold felt a surge of pride at his granddaughter's mature thinking. That would require restructuring the company as a corporation with a formal board of directors, which would also provide additional legal protections against future inheritance challenges, Emma added. "Corporate governance laws are much clearer than estate law when it comes to succession planning." David was nodding slowly. "I like it. It plays to both our strengths and creates checks and balances." "There's more," Emma said, flipping through her notes. "I think we should establish the Whitmore Foundation as a separate entity. Dad could serve as president, managing charitable giving and community relations. It would give him a platform to rebuild his public profile after everything that happened with Margaret." Harold leaned back in his chair, amazed at the comprehensive business restructuring his 17-year-old granddaughter had developed. "Emma, this is graduate-level strategic planning." "I had good teachers," she replied with a grin. "Plus, surviving a murder conspiracy really clarifies your priorities." Over the next hour, they discussed the details of Emma's proposal. The restructuring would take 18 months to complete, giving Emma time to finish high school and begin her undergraduate studies, while David assumed greater operational responsibilities. "Third agenda item," Harold said finally, "personal security." The mood in the room immediately sobered. Margaret was in prison, but Catherine Holbrook had connections to organized crime, and Robert's creditors were still unaccounted for. "I've hired Blackwater Security Services," Harold announced. "They specialize in executive protection for high-net-worth families. David, you'll have a security detail for the next 6 months. Emma, you'll have protection at Stanford and during any travel." Emma frowned. "Grandpa, I don't want to live in fear. Margaret's in prison. Catherine's been captured." "Emma, we destroyed a criminal network worth millions of dollars. The people behind that network aren't just going to write off their losses and move on to other victims." David nodded grimly. "Dad's right. I've been getting strange phone calls. Cars following me from the office. Someone's conducting surveillance." Harold pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "Tommy Reeves identified at least 3 suspicious vehicles in our neighborhood over the past month. Professional surveillance teams, not random criminals." Emma studied the surveillance photos Tommy had taken. "So we're still in danger?" We're targets, Harold corrected, but we're prepared targets now. No more surprises. No more trusting people without verification. No more assuming that family connections guarantee loyalty. The weight of that statement settled over all three of them. Margaret's betrayal had fundamentally changed how they viewed relationships and trust. Fourth agenda item, Harold continued, is the most important one: family healing. He looked at David, seeing the pain that still lingered in his son's eyes. David, I know you blame yourself for what happened. I need you to stop. Dad, I lived with that woman for 12 years. I slept next to a sociopath, had conversations with her every day, trusted her judgment about you. How could I have been so blind? Emma reached over and took her father's hand. Dad, Margaret fooled everyone. Tommy Reeves ran background checks and didn't find her criminal connections. Patricia Morrison worked with her for 2 years and never suspected anything. Even Grandpa didn't realize what she was until she made her final move. Emma's right, Harold added. Margaret was a professional con artist with sophisticated training and resources. She targeted our family specifically because we were successful and trusting. That's not a character flaw. It's exactly the kind of family bond that most people spend their lives trying to build. David wiped his eyes, struggling with emotions he'd been suppressing for months. I keep thinking about all the times she manipulated conversations, turned me against you, made me doubt my own father. How many family dinners did she poison with her lies? All of them, Harold said bluntly. But David, those weren't real family dinners. They were performances designed to serve Margaret's agenda. The real family dinners are the ones we're going to have from now on. Emma pulled out her phone and began typing. Speaking of which, I'm instituting a new family tradition. Weekly dinners, no phones, no business talk unless it's actually interesting. And Grandpa has to cook at least once a month. I haven't cooked in 20 years, Harold protested. Then you better start learning, Emma replied with a grin. YouTube has excellent tutorials. The laughter that followed was the first genuine family moment they'd shared since before Margaret's campaign began. It felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into sunlight. Final agenda item, Harold said, his voice becoming serious again. My medical evaluation results. He distributed copies of Dr. Chen's comprehensive assessment to David and Emma. The document was 47 pages of cognitive tests, psychological evaluations, and medical analyses. The bottom line, Harold explained, is that I'm in exceptional health for my age. Cognitively, physically, and psychologically. Dr. Chen estimates I have at least 10 to 15 years of active leadership capability. David looked confused. Dad, that's wonderful news, but why does it sound like you're leading up to something? Harold smiled. Because I am. I'm not retiring. I'm not stepping back. And I'm definitely not dying anytime soon. Margaret was wrong about everything, and I intend to prove it every single day. Emma clapped her hands together. Does this mean you're going to start dating? The question caught Harold completely off guard. Dating? Emma, I'm 85 years old. So? You're healthy, wealthy, intelligent, and distinguished. Plus, you just survived an assassination attempt, which makes you mysterious and dangerous. Some women find that attractive. David nearly choked on his coffee. Emma, are you seriously trying to set up your grandfather? Why not? He's been alone since Grandma died 15 years ago. Margaret's gone, the family's healing, the business is secure. Maybe it's time for Grandpa to have some fun. Harold found himself considering the possibility for the first time in decades. Margaret's betrayal had reminded him that life was unpredictable and precious. Perhaps Emma was right about embracing new experiences. We'll see, he said diplomatically, but first, we have a company to run and a family to rebuild. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave the conference room, Emma stopped at the doorway. Grandpa, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret fighting back against Margaret? I mean, we could have just let her have the money and avoided all the danger and drama. Harold considered the question carefully. Emma, fighting Margaret wasn't about the money. It was about refusing to let evil triumph through deception and manipulation. If we'd given in to her demands, she would have destroyed our family from the inside out, turned us against each other, and spent the rest of her life hurting other people. So it was worth it? Every minute of it, Harold replied firmly. Some battles choose you, Emma. When they do, you have two options: fight or surrender. I've never been good at surrendering. Emma nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Neither am I. As they walked through the Whitmore construction headquarters, past photographs of buildings they'd constructed and projects they'd completed, Harold felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His legacy wasn't just the company he'd built or the money he'd accumulated. It was the values he'd instilled in his family and the courage they'd shown when those values were tested. Margaret had been wrong about one thing: Harold wasn't dying anytime soon. He had too much left to do, too much left to protect, and too many years left to enjoy watching Emma grow into the leader he knew she could become. At 85 years old, Harold Whitmore had faced his greatest challenge and emerged victorious. His legacy was secure, his family was healing, and his future was brighter than ever. The war for his legacy was over, and Harold Whitmore had won. The call came at 2:17 a.m. Margaret's phone shrieked through the darkness of her bedroom, jerking her from sleep. David groaned beside her, but she was already reaching for the device, her heart pounding with anticipation. Mrs. Whitmore? The voice was professional, clinical. This is Dr. Richard Chen at Massachusetts General Hospital. I'm afraid I have some very difficult news about your father-in-law. Margaret sat up straighter, nudging David awake. She'd been expecting this call, though perhaps not quite this soon. What's happened? Mr. Whitmore suffered a massive myocardial infarction approximately 30 minutes ago. He was brought in by ambulance, but I'm very sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. We did everything we could. David was fully awake now, grabbing for the phone. What? What about my father? Margaret held the phone away from him, her mind racing. Doctor, are you saying Harold is? I'm afraid Mr. Whitmore passed away at 1:52 a.m. The stress from today's incident appears to have triggered a cardiac event. At his age, with his medical history. Margaret felt a surge of triumph, so intense she had to bite her lip to keep from smiling. Harold Whitmore, the stubborn old bastard who'd stood between her and $100 million, was finally dead. We'll be right there, she managed, injecting just the right amount of grief into her voice. David was already stumbling out of bed, reaching for his clothes. Dad's gone? His voice was hollow with shock. Margaret hung up and immediately began calculating. Harold's death would trigger the will reading within 48 hours. She needed to move fast to consolidate her position before anyone could challenge her authority. But first, she had a phone call to make. 20 minutes later, as David sat numbly in the hospital waiting room, Margaret stepped outside and dialed a number she'd memorized but never saved in her contacts. It's done, she said when the familiar voice answered. Already? Robert Ashford sounded surprised. I thought the old man was tougher than that. The stress finally got to him. Heart attack, just like we planned. What about the investigation into that caregiver incident? Margaret's smile was cold. What investigation? A delusional old man attacked an innocent healthcare worker, then died of a heart attack brought on by his own paranoid episode. Case closed. And David? David's in shock. He'll do whatever I tell him to do, especially once he realizes how complicated Harold's business affairs are. He's gonna need guidance from people who understand the construction industry. Robert chuckled. Good thing he has a family willing to help out. Speaking of which, we need to move on from the Patricia Morrison situation. I want her to initiate probate proceedings immediately. And I want to update Harold's signed challenge on competency grounds. Margaret, the man just died. Don't you think it's a little soon to be grabbing his money? Robert Harold Whitmore spent 60 years building that company. If we give his enemies time to organize, they'll find ways to challenge our control. We strike now, while everyone's still reeling from his death. What Margaret didn't know was that her phone call was being monitored from a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. Detective Santos sat with headphones on, recording every word while Tommy Reeves operated the electronic equipment. Jesus Christ, Santos muttered. She's not even pretending to grieve. In the back of the van, Harold Whitmore listened to his daughter-in-law celebrate his death with a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. The plan was working perfectly. She's moving faster than we expected, Harold said quietly. Emma, are you ready for your part? Emma nodded grimly. She'd spent the past 6 hours preparing for the most important performance of her life. I've got Margaret's calendar synchronized on my phone. I know exactly where she'll be and when. Remember, you're devastated by your grandfather's death, but you're also terrified about your future, Detective Santos coached. Margaret will try to comfort you by promising that your college fund is secure. And that's when I get her to admit she knows the fund was tied to Harold's will update, Emma finished. Harold reached over and squeezed his granddaughter's hand. Emma, if this goes wrong. It won't go wrong, Emma said firmly. Margaret's weakness is her arrogance. She thinks she's smarter than everyone else, and that's going to destroy her. 2 hours later, Emma sat in Margaret's living room, tissues clutched in her hand and tears streaming down her face. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, the grieving granddaughter who'd lost the most important person in her life. I just can't believe he's gone, Emma sobbed. Yesterday morning he was fine, and now… Margaret sat beside her on the couch, rubbing Emma's back with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. Sweetheart, I know this is devastating. Your grandfather loved you so much. What's going to happen to me now? Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. My college fund, my future. Grandpa always said he'd take care of everything. But what if he didn't have time to arrange things properly? Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. What do you mean? Arrange things properly? Well, he mentioned something about updating his will recently, but I don't know if he actually did it. And with everything that happened yesterday with that crazy woman. Emma, what exactly did your grandfather tell you about his will? Emma sniffled and wiped her nose. He said he was making sure I'd have control of the company when I turned 25, with Dad managing things until then. But Margaret, what if the stress from yesterday made him forget to sign the papers? What if there's no provision for my education? Margaret leaned forward, her predatory instincts fully engaged. Emma, sweetheart, you don't need to worry about any of that. I don't. Your grandfather's will update was completed and filed 3 weeks ago. Your college fund is secure, and your future inheritance is protected. Emma's eyes widened. How do you know that? Margaret realized her mistake a split second too late. Her face went pale as she scrambled for an explanation. David mentioned it. Your father was concerned about the legal implications. Dad doesn't know anything about Grandpa's legal affairs, Emma said, her tears suddenly stopping. You told me that yourself, so how do you know about the update? Margaret stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Emma, you're upset and not thinking clearly. I think you should go home and get some rest. But Emma wasn't finished. Margaret, did you know that Carol Hendricks was really Catherine Holbrook? Margaret spun around, her mask finally slipping completely. What did you say? I said, did you know that the woman you sent to take care of my grandfather was actually a wanted criminal? Emma, I think your grief is making you paranoid. Just like your grandfather, you're starting to see conspiracies where none exist. Am I? Then why did you meet with Catherine 2 weeks before she showed up at Grandpa's house? And why did you pay her $5,000 in cash? Margaret's face had gone completely white. How do you… Emma, who have you been talking to? Emma pulled out her phone and held it up, showing the recording app that had been running for the past 20 minutes. Nobody, Margaret, I've been talking to you. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at the phone in Emma's hand, her mind racing through the implications of everything she'd just admitted. You little bitch, Margaret whispered. You set me up. I learned from the best, Emma replied, backing toward the door. Did you really think a 17-year-old could outsmart someone as clever as you? Unless, of course, someone was helping her. Margaret's eyes widened as the full scope of the trap became clear. Harold's alive. Surprise, Emma said with Harold's predatory smile. Margaret lunged for Emma's phone, but the front door burst open and Detective Santos rushed in with 2 uniformed officers. Margaret Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and fraud. As the handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists, she looked at Emma with pure hatred. This won't stick. You have no proof of anything except a grieving widow trying to comfort her stepdaughter. Emma held up her phone again. Actually, we have your confession about knowing Catherine Holbrook's real identity, your admission that you knew about Grandpa's will update, and Your phone call with Uncle Robert, where you celebrated Grandpa's death and planned to steal his company. That phone call was private. Not when you're under surveillance for attempted murder, Detective Santos replied cheerfully. David appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. Margaret, what's going on? Why are you being arrested? Emma looked at her father with genuine sympathy. Dad, sit down. There's something you need to know about your wife. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, screaming about false accusations and family conspiracies, Harold Whitmore stepped out of the surveillance van parked across the street. He was very much alive, and very much ready to reclaim his life. The war for his legacy was over. Margaret had lost everything, her husband, her freedom, and her dream of controlling the Whitmore fortune. But for Harold, the victory felt hollow. His son's marriage was destroyed, his family was fractured, and he'd had to fake his own death to expose the truth about the woman who'd lived in their midst. Some battles, Harold reflected, were won at too high a price, but some battles had to be fought regardless of the cost. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.